My brother didn't just fire me the night he walked into my office with that envelope. He looked at me like I was a liability he'd been meaning to clear from the books for years. He dropped a manila folder on my desk, crossed his arms, and said the words with the kind of calm that only comes from rehearsal. "We found the discrepancy, Claire. Security is waiting downstairs." He didn't ask me to explain. He didn't leave room for it. He just reached across my desk and took my keycard off the lanyard like he was reclaiming something that had always belonged to him. I looked at my father, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and waited for him to say something. He looked at the carpet. That was my answer. "I want you to stop right there with me for a second, because before I tell you what happened 18 years later when my brother called my office in tears, I need you to understand what that room felt like. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's here with me tonight." I was 22 years old. I had been working at my father's logistics company, Hargrove Freight, since I was 19, filing invoices, learning the software, eventually managing the books. My grandfather had built that company from a single truck and a handshake, and my father had inherited it, and it was supposed to come to both of us, to my brother, and to me equally, per the trust my grandfather set up before he died. I knew those accounts the way some people know hymns, by heart, without looking. So when my brother sat across from that auditor in December and pointed at a series of transfers totaling just over $40,000 and said those transfers had my login credentials attached to them, I knew two things simultaneously. First, that the money had moved. Second, that I had not moved it. Those two facts sat in my chest like stones as security walked me through the lobby of the building my grandfather had named after our family. My father didn't fire me, technically. He just didn't stop it. That distinction kept me awake for years. I drove to my apartment, packed 2 bags, and sat on the edge of my bed until the sun came up. There was nothing dramatic about it. No storm, no screaming, just the particular silence of a life that has been quietly canceled. I had $1,000 in my personal checking account, a car with 200,000 miles on it, and a pen my grandfather had given me the day I graduated high school. It was a simple brass pen, nothing fancy. He'd pressed it into my hand and said, "Keep your signature honest, sweetheart. Everything else follows from that." I put it in my jacket pocket before I left, and I drove north without a plan. I ended up in Portland. I had a cousin there who let me sleep on her couch for 2 weeks before I found a room in a house share near the river. I applied to 9 accounting positions in the first month. 2 called me back. When they ran my background through their systems and the name Hargrove Freight came up with the notation my brother had made sure to file terminated for cause, financial misconduct, both of them went quiet. Neither called again. I was good with numbers. I had always been good with numbers. But a number doesn't do you any good when someone has already written the wrong story next to your name. The woman who changed that was named Ruth. She ran a 2-person bookkeeping practice out of a cramped second-floor office on Burnside, and she posted a handwritten index card in the window of the coffee shop downstairs, looking for part-time help. I walked in on a Tuesday morning because I had run out of places to apply that didn't require references. Ruth was 61, had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead at all times, and had the particular quality of someone who has seen enough human nonsense to be unimpressed by most of it. She handed me a cup of coffee and a set of bank statements and told me to find the error. I found 3 in 11 minutes. She hired me on the spot. I told her the truth about Hargrove Freight 6 weeks later. I told her I hadn't done it. She looked at me over her glasses for a long moment and said, "I know. I've watched you work. Someone who steals from a company doesn't do reconciliations like you do." Then she turned back to her monitor and said, "So learn to prove it." That became the next chapter of my life. Not surviving, I was past survival within a year. Building. I studied forensic accounting at night through an online program, then sat for my CPA, then added a CFE certification. Ruth taught me how to read a company the way a doctor reads an x-ray looking for what's missing, for the shadow, where the bone should be. I learned that financial fraud doesn't hide in big dramatic moments. It hides in small, ordinary-looking entries. A recurring vendor no one can name, a reimbursement with no attached receipt, a transfer between subsidiaries that routes through an address no one has visited. I became very good at finding those things. By the time I was 28, I had moved from Ruth's practice to a regional forensic firm as a junior analyst. By 30, I was the person the attorneys called when a case needed someone to translate the numbers into a story a jury could follow. I had a small apartment, a good salary, and a reputation that was mine alone, built under a version of my name that had nothing attached to it except the work I had done. But I had not forgotten. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say I had not forgotten. I don't mean I spent those years angry. Anger is expensive, and I had learned to be careful with my expenses. What I mean is that I kept a file. Not obsessively, not in a way that ran my life, but methodically, the way you keep records of anything that might matter later. I pulled the public filings for Hargrove Freight every quarter. I watched the revenue numbers flatten, then decline. I noted when my brother brought in a silent partner whose name I didn't recognize. I noted when they restructured the company twice in 3 years, which is almost always a sign that someone is trying to move weight from one side of a scale to the other. I noted when a former employee filed a wage claim and then abruptly withdrew it. I wasn't hunting. I was waiting. My grandfather's trust had never been formally dissolved. I was still a named beneficiary. My brother and my father had apparently assumed that when I left under those circumstances, I had forfeited that claim, or that I wouldn't know to pursue it, or that the humiliation would keep me quiet. They were wrong on all 3 counts. I had a lawyer in Portland who had been monitoring that trust on my behalf for 4 years. Her name was Denise, and she was the kind of attorney who spoke in complete sentences and charged accordingly, and she was worth every invoice. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was at my desk reviewing a client's accounts receivable aging report when my cell rang with a number I didn't recognize from an area code I did recognize. It was the one I had grown up calling long distance. I let it go to voicemail. My brother's voice, when I played it back, had the texture of someone who has practiced composure and failed. He said he needed to talk to me. He said it was about the business. He said things had gotten complicated and that he and my father wanted to sit down, and that there was money involved that I was entitled to, and he hoped we could handle this like family. I listened to it twice. Then I called Denise. She had already received a letter. Hargrove Freight was facing a federal investigation into a pattern of fraudulent invoicing through a shell vendor my brother had created using a retired employee's tax ID number. The forensic audit being conducted by a firm I happened to know well, since 2 of their partners had been my mentors, had surfaced the same vendor across 11 quarters of billing, totaling nearly $400,000 in payments for services never rendered. The investigation had also flagged an anomaly in the company's historical records. Specifically, it flagged a series of transfers from 8 years prior that had been manually attributed to a former employee's login credentials. Mine. The investigator had called Denise because I was a named party in those records. She had told them I would cooperate fully. She told me one more thing. My grandfather's trust, which had been quietly generating returns for 18 years, and which my brother had apparently convinced my father to treat as a personal operating reserve, drawing against it to fund the shell vendor payments when cash flow was tight, was now a central exhibit in the federal case. And since I was a 50% beneficiary, whose distributions had been withheld since my departure, the back distributions owed to me, with interest, were substantial. Denise said the word substantial, the way accountants say it, which means she then gave me the number, and the number was not subtle. I sat with that information for 2 days. I went to work, I ate dinner, I called my cousin in Portland, who had always known some version of what had happened, and I told her what was coming. Then I called my brother back. He picked up on the first ring. His voice, when he realized it was me, had a quality I can only describe as tactical relief, the sound of someone who has been dreading a call, and also desperately needed it to happen. He said my name. He said it had been too long. He said he was sorry about how things ended, that it had been a difficult time for everyone, that my father wasn't well. I let him talk for about 90 seconds. Then I said, I've spoken to my attorney. She'll be in touch about the trust distributions. There was a silence. Claire, he said, we should talk in person. Before this goes any further, there's a lot of context you don't have. I have quite a bit of context, I said. More than you'd expect. Another silence. Longer. Dad wants to see you. He's been wanting to reach out for years. He just didn't know how. I felt something move through me then. Not softness. Something more like clarity, the same feeling I get when I'm working through a set of financials and the pattern finally resolves into something legible. I understood exactly what was happening. My father's health was declining. The business was imploding. The federal investigation was public enough that their board members and lenders were pulling back, and they needed the trust funds I was owed to be redirected, voluntarily, to shore up what was left. They needed my signature and my silence. That was why they were calling. Not because they were sorry. Because they were overdrawn. Tell my father I hope he feels better, I said. And tell your attorney to expect a call from Denise on Monday. I hung up and set the phone face down on my desk. I didn't feel satisfaction. Not yet. I felt the particular alertness of someone who has been working a case for a long time and can see that the final phase has arrived. The meeting I hadn't known would be the meeting happened 6 weeks later. Hargrove Freight had a quarterly investor briefing, a small affair, maybe 30 people, mostly local lenders and 2 longtime partners who had been with the company since my grandfather's era. My brother had been presenting these briefings for years. I found out about this one from Denise, who had been forwarded the agenda as part of the discovery process. The briefing was being used, she believed, as an attempt to present a restructuring narrative to investors before the federal case went public, to get ahead of the story, to manage it. I called the lead federal investigator that afternoon. Then I called my contact at the forensic firm handling the case. Then I made one more call, to a woman named Patricia, who had worked the accounts receivable desk at Hargrove Freight for 15 years, before she quietly retired, who had called my cell phone 3 months after I was fired, and told me she didn't believe what they said about me, and who had kept a copy of certain documents in a folder in her home office ever since, just in case. Patricia, I said, I think it's time. The briefing was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of mid-century glass box that feels important without being impressive. I arrived early and sat near the back. I wore a gray blazer and my grandfather's pen in my inside pocket. A few people recognized my last name on the sign-in sheet and looked at me sideways. I smiled and said nothing. My brother walked in at 2 o'clock with my father behind him. My father was using a cane now. He was smaller than I remembered, not in height, but in presence. As if the thing that had made him seem immovable when I was 22 had been quietly consuming itself from the inside for years. He scanned the room the way he always had, cataloging faces, calculating. And when his eyes found mine, he stopped walking for a half step before recovering. My brother saw his pause and followed his gaze and went still. I gave them both a small, composed nod. My brother sat up at the front of the room. He had slides. He had a practiced tone, the voice of a man who has done enough investor calls to know where to modulate and where to add gravity. He began talking about operational realignment, about the strength of the core business, about a path forward that he called a return to the fundamentals our founder built. He was on the 3rd slide when Denise slipped into the back row next to me. He was on the 7th slide, the restructuring proposal, when the room's A.V. monitor flickered. My brother stopped mid-sentence and looked at the screen. It had gone dark. He looked toward the tech corner. The technician, a young man who worked for the Federal Investigators Support Team and not for Hargrove Freight, gave a neutral shrug. The screen came back on. But it was not the restructuring slide. It was a spreadsheet. Specifically, it was the Hargrove Freight vendor payment register for a company called Midland Supply Solutions, showing 47 invoices over 11 quarters. Every one of them paid, none of them corresponding to any delivery, warehouse entry, or receiving log in the company's own system. The total at the bottom was displayed in a font size that required no squinting. The room shifted. I could hear it, the particular low register sound of people adjusting their understanding of where they are and why. My brother's voice cracked once before he controlled it. There's been a technical error. If we could just... The screen split. On the left, the vendor register. On the right, the incorporation documents for Midland Supply Solutions, filed in Nevada, showing the registered agent as a woman none of the investors would recognize, but who Denise's team had identified as the girlfriend of the employee my brother had used to set up the fictitious vendor. Beneath that, a screenshot of a bank account in that same woman's name, showing regular transfers that matched the invoice amounts to the dollar. "I'd like to ask a question," said one of the longtime partners, a man who had shaken my grandfather's hand at the company's founding luncheon. He was 70 years old, and his voice was very quiet. "Is that real?" My brother was still standing at the front of the room. My father had not moved from his seat. Neither of them was looking at me yet. They were looking at the screen with the expression of people watching something fall that they had believed was secured. I stood up. The room turned. My brother turned. My father turned. I walked down the center aisle slowly, the way you move when you have no reason to hurry. I reached the front and stood next to the podium. My brother took a step back, almost involuntary, as if the gravitational physics of the room had quietly rearranged themselves. "My name is Claire Hargrove," I said, facing the room. "I'm a certified forensic accountant, and I was the bookkeeper for this company from the time I was 19 until I was 22, when my brother filed a false misconduct report attributing transfers he had made to my login credentials. I left this city with nothing. I want you to know that, before I say the next part." The room was very quiet. "The transfers you're looking at on that screen are not the beginning of this story. They're the middle of it." I nodded toward the screen, where Denise's team had now added a third panel, the internal access log from 8 years ago, showing that the credentials used to make the original transfers I had been blamed for were my login, but the IP address was registered to a company-issued laptop assigned to my brother's office. My father made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. "The federal investigation that is now active and which several of you have already received inquiry letters about includes this documentation as part of its evidentiary record," I continued. "I've cooperated fully. I am not here as a victim. I'm here because this company was built by my grandfather, and the partners in this room deserve to understand exactly what has been done with their investment and their trust." My brother stepped forward. His voice had dropped to something private and urgent. "Claire, stop. You don't know everything. There are things you don't know. We can fix this privately. The trust, everything. We can." I looked at him. I thought about the lobby of that building, the keycard, the carpet my father had studied instead of my face. I thought about the 9 job applications, and the 2 callbacks that went silent, and the couch in Portland, and Ruth's index card in the coffee shop window. "I know enough," I said. "I've known enough for a long time. I just waited until the books were ready." I reached into my inside jacket pocket and set my grandfather's pen on the podium. "He gave me this the day I graduated," I said, "to no one in particular, and to everyone. He told me to keep my signature honest. I have. I'd like to think he'd recognize the difference between the people in this room who did the same, and the people who didn't." I stepped back from the podium. 2 investigators who had been stationed in the hall came through the door. They were not dramatic about it. They moved with the efficiency of people who have done this many times and consider it paperwork more than theater. One of them addressed my brother by his full name and told him he was being detained for questioning. The other approached my father. My father looked at me then. Really looked. For what I believe was the first time since I was 22, and standing in the doorway of his office and waiting for him to say something. He looked old and small, and I could see in his face that he understood the distance between what he had done and what he could have done, and that he had been carrying that understanding quietly for a while now. I had prepared something for this moment, some version of a final sentence, the kind that lands with the weight of 18 years behind it. But standing there in that room, looking at him, I found I didn't need it. I wasn't performing a verdict. I was just finishing an audit. "I hope you feel better," I said. The same thing I told my brother to pass along 6 weeks ago, and I meant it, in the cold, clean way that I meant it, the way you wish someone well, not because you owe them warmth, but because you're done carrying the alternative. I picked up my grandfather's pen from the podium and walked out through the side door. The next months moved with the steady rhythm of institutional processes. My brother was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of identity fraud relating to the original transfers attributed to my credentials, and 2 counts relating to the shell vendor scheme. He pleaded down to 4 counts and received a sentence that included restitution in 5 years, of which he would serve a portion. My father was not charged. He was elderly and his health had deteriorated significantly, and the investigators concluded his direct involvement in the fraud was limited to willful ignorance rather than active participation. That distinction has its own kind of consequence, I think. The trust distributions owed to me, calculated by Denise's team with 18 years of accumulated returns and withheld income, settled outside of court. I will not give you the number, but I will tell you it was enough to do the thing I had been quietly planning for 3 years. Ruth had been trying to retire for a long time. Her practice was profitable and she had 2 loyal clients she couldn't bring herself to leave. I bought the practice from her, restructured it, brought in 2 junior analysts, and renamed it. We specialize in forensic reviews for small and mid-sized businesses, exactly the kind of company where the fraud lives in ordinary-looking entries, and no one is watching closely enough. We work a lot of cases where someone has been blamed for something they didn't do. I am not objective about those cases. I work them the way you work something personal, which is to say carefully, and without stopping, until the numbers tell the truth. Patricia, who had kept those documents in her home office for all those years, came to work with us part-time. She does our client intake. She has good instincts about people. A few weeks after the settlement finalized, I drove out to the coast. There's a stretch of the Oregon coast past Cannon Beach where the rocks come down to the water in these long gray shelves and the waves hit them at an angle that sounds like a door closing. I parked and walked down to the water's edge and stood there for a long time. The air was cold and smelled like salt and something older than the day. I reached into my jacket. I wasn't going to throw the pen. I want to be clear about that. My grandfather gave me that pen and I intend to keep it. But I had brought something else, the printout of the original misconduct report my brother had filed on me 18 years ago. The one that had followed my name across every job application for years. The one I had obtained through discovery, and kept in a folder at the back of my filing cabinet as a kind of evidence of the before. I folded it once. I thought about everything that piece of paper had cost me in terms of time and doors, and the particular exhaustion of building a reputation when someone has already written a false version of it. I thought about Ruth in Portland, and the 9 applications. I thought about my grandfather's voice telling me to keep my signature honest. Then I set the paper down on a flat rock and let the tide take it. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the volcanic release I might have expected at 22. When I would have wanted this to feel like an explosion. It felt quieter than that. It felt like closing a file that has been open on your desktop for a long time, not because you'd stopped caring, but because the work was finally done and the finding was clear and there was nothing left to dispute. I stood there until the cold got specific and then I walked back to my car. I had a call at 5 with a new client, a family-owned restaurant group in Seattle, whose CFO had just been quietly escorted out after someone in accounts payable noticed a vendor that couldn't be traced to any service provider in the system. They needed someone to come in and read the numbers honestly. I put my grandfather's pen in my jacket pocket. I drove back toward the city. There are people who will tell you that building something after someone destroys your foundation is a story about resilience. I don't entirely disagree, but I think that framing puts the emphasis in the wrong place. What I actually built was a skill. I became very, very good at the specific thing my brother tried to weaponize against me, the reading of financial records, the finding of the truth inside systems that are designed to obscure it. He handed me a direction by trying to use it as a weapon. I followed that direction until I was better at it than he ever imagined possible. That is not an inspiring reframe. That is just what happened. If you have ever been handed something meant as a weapon and figured out how to make it into a tool, you already know what I'm talking about. You don't need me to dress it up. You know exactly what it cost and you know exactly what it built, and you understand that both of those things are true at the same time. My grandfather's company doesn't exist under that name anymore. The restructuring sold the assets to a regional freight carrier out of Boise. The name Hargrove Freight was retired as part of the sale. I don't have complicated feelings about that. The name was never the thing he left me. What he left me was the pen, and the instruction, and the understanding that honest work over time is not a guarantee of comfort, but it is a guarantee of something more durable than comfort. I keep the pen on my desk now, next to my monitor. My junior analysts have asked about it. I tell them it's a reminder about signatures. They nod like that makes obvious sense, which I appreciate. If this story found you tonight, if you've ever been walked out of something that was supposed to be yours and told to make your peace with it, I want you to understand something. The people who do that are counting on you to accept the story they wrote next to your name. They are counting on the gap between what actually happened and what you can prove. That gap is not permanent. It is a problem with a solution. It just requires time and precision, and the willingness to keep working when the outcome isn't visible yet. I know that's harder than it sounds. I know what the long middle looks like. But I also know what the end of a completed audit looks like. And I promise you, it is worth the time it takes to get there. Please share this story if it meant something to you. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are tonight. You are not carrying this alone.